Welcome back to Let's Talk Crime. I'm your host, Preet.
And I'm your host, Manveer. Thanks for joining us for another episode where we break down crime, justice, and the issues that shape our world. This week, we're focusing on a major yet often overlooked issue, environmental harm, with a particular emphasis on its intersection with crime, power, and inequality.
When we talk about environmental harm, we're not just talking about littering or recycling. We're talking about large-scale damage caused by powerful corporations and institutions. Harm that often goes unpunished and unnoticed.
And today we'll be breaking the episode into 4 segments: environmental crime, environmental racism, harm-based approaches, and crimes of the powerful.
So stick with us as we break down how these harms occur, who they affect the most, and why holding powerful actors accountable matters. So, what exactly is environmental harm? Let's break it down. When most people think about environmental harm, they think about individual actions. Things like driving instead of using transit, letting the tap run too long, food waste, or cutting down trees. And while those things matter, they barely scratch the surface of what scholars describe as environmental harm or environmental crime. If we only look at what's illegal, environmental crime would include things like illegal dumping, poaching, or companies breaking pollution limits. But green criminologists argue that this legal definition is far too narrow. Gladkova and her colleagues point out that some of the most damaging environmental actions are completely legal. This includes approved industrial pollution, state-sanctioned resource extraction, or emissions that meet regulatory standards but still harm ecosystems and human health. This is where critical criminologists like Ruggiero and South make an important point. The law doesn't necessarily reflect what is harmful. It reflects the interests of powerful institutions. So when a harmful practice benefits major industries or governments, it's far less likely to be criminalized. Barak puts this really clearly. He argues that we need to focus on harm, not just crime, because something can be perfectly legal and still cause massive environmental and social damage. A good example of this is McClanahan's work on water justice. He shows how corporations and governments can privatize water, restrict access, or allow destructive extraction practices that devastate communities. None of that is labeled criminal, yet the communities that protest or resist those decisions often become the ones who face policing and punishment, which we'll actually talk about in more detail later during our environmental racism segment. So when we talk about environmental crime from a critical criminology perspective, we're not just talking about illegal acts or rule breaking. We're talking about environmental harm in a broad sense. This means all the damage done to ecosystems, resources, and human health, whether the law recognizes it or not. And that brings us to the real heart of the issue. Environmental crime isn't just an environmental topic. It's a question of power. It's about who gets to define what counts as crime, whose harm matters, and who is protected by the law versus who is sacrificed by it.
Environmental crime doesn't affect everyone equally. Certain marginalized communities are more likely to live in areas by toxic waste. Communities with people of color and people with a lower socioeconomic status are more likely to have toxic waste placed near them compared to communities with white people or those with higher status. Marginalized populations have less power and resources and are unable to resist when companies are dumping waste by them. Waste includes things like toxic chemicals and other substances that negatively affect health and can lead to cancer. If any of our listeners are interested in learning more, there's a link in the description to the documentary There's Something in the Water, which is a real-life example on how toxic waste and pollution affected a marginalized community. Lynch states that communities have disadvantages and advantages, which are an indicator of the social, economic, and ecological injustice that marginalized communities face. Communities with lower income and people of color are more likely to be exposed to toxins, chemicals, and waste. An example that McClanahan provides is when the government of Bolivia privatized their water supply in a region where more than 50% of the people are indigenous. A billion-dollar corporation had control over the water and tripled prices. They even cut off water services for people who couldn't pay and charged people who tried to collect rainwater. People protested and the government eventually severed their contracts. People who couldn't pay the prices couldn't even try and collect rainwater because they were being charged for that too. These people were basically being punished by a large corporation and having access to a basic need taken away from them because they didn't have the money to pay. This isn't the first time something like this has happened in Bolivia. Why are people being punished by having basic necessities taken away because they don't have the money to pay for them? Specifically lower class, indigenous, and people of color. Being charged for even the rainwater they collected took away all access to water. But it wasn't seen as a crime. I think that's why we need to shift focus away from environmental crime to environmental harm and look at things with a harm-based perspective. A harm-based focus means looking at everything that causes harm, even if it isn't technically considered illegal. Now, why do we need a harm-based perspective? Most environmental law is made based on how it affects humans, which means the environment isn't properly protected or recognized as something that has value separate from what it can provide us. Moving past what's criminal lets us look at all actions that can harm people, animals, and nature. An example is deforestation, which is legal as long as you have the right permits and follow the laws, but is incredibly harmful to the environment and species that live in the area, regardless of if you follow the laws or not. Ugwadike claims that these harmful actions are normalized by social practices and rarely punished, which allows corporations to continue making money because they can do what they want as long as they have something like a permit or follow a law that doesn't really protect the environment but instead controls who uses it and how they use it. The law will always try to balance making money with protecting the environment, and it always fails to actually protect the environment. Barack claims that environmental harm can be produced and protected by the state through systems that legitimize damaging practices like water privatization in Bolivia. The law can hide and enable environmental harm, controlling the ecosystem instead of protecting it. This leads into our section on environmental harms committed by the powerful.
So, now that we've talked about environmental racism and why a harm-based focus matters, we also need to look at who is responsible for most of this harm. And this brings us to the idea of crimes of the powerful. These are harms committed by corporations, governments, and major institutions that have the influence to shape laws, shape narratives, and avoid accountability. Walby and Gorkif explain that power doesn't just operate through laws or punishment. It also works through the ways issues are framed and talked about. When powerful institutions control the language, they also control what the public sees as normal, acceptable, or even inevitable. So a corporation contaminating water becomes an operational issue, and a pipeline leak becomes a technical malfunction, instead of being talked about as harm or wrongdoing. Meanwhile, when marginalized communities resist or speak out, they're the ones labeled as threatening, irrational, or criminal. Spade explains how legal systems tend to individualize harm and ignore the broader structures that produce inequality. The law focuses on a few bad actors, but leaves the systems that cause environmental damage untouched. That means corporations can legally pollute, legally extract resources, and legally place hazardous industries next to low-income and racialized communities, because the law was built around their interests. So when the harm is massive, there's no legal category to hold them accountable. Ugude points out that these harms often go unnoticed because they're embedded in practices we consider legitimate, such as business operations, economic development, and government decision-making. When powerful institutions can cause harm, it becomes normalized. It's not seen as deviant, it's just seen as how things work. McClanahan's example from Bolivia is a clear example of exploitation and harm. But none of it was treated as criminal, because it was backed by the government and protected by law. Again, the only people labeled criminal were the ones protesting to survive. Barack's work ties this all together, as he explains that harm can be produced, justified, and protected by the state itself. When the state legitimizes harmful corporate practices, it becomes almost impossible to hold powerful actors accountable. So when we talk about crimes of the powerful, we're talking about large-scale environmental harm caused by institutions with enough power to rewrite the rules in their favor. And until we recognize these harms as crimes, not just business decisions or economic necessities, the people with the most power will continue causing the most damage with the least consequences.
That wraps up today's episode of Let's Talk Crime. We hope this conversation helped shine some light on the deeper issues behind environmental harm.
Remember, these harms aren't just environmental, they're shaped by power, inequality, and decisions made by institutions that often avoid accountability.
If you want to explore any of the readings or research we mentioned today, you can find all our sources listed in the transcript of this episode.
Thanks for tuning in, and feel free to share this episode with anyone interested in environmental justice or crimes of the powerful.
We'll catch you next time on Let's Talk Crime.